you so much for having me, both everyone who's come tonight, and then I want to extend a special applause to Bettina, because I know that when I was 21, I was not throwing a gala and running my own business. I was imbibing in brown-colored liquids and having a very good time in college, so I find this incredibly impressive. And I just wanted to tell her thank you for having me, and thank you for all the effort you put in to do this. It's truly extraordinary, and if you've done this at 21, I can't even imagine what you're going to be doing at 31. It's absolutely insane to me. Woo! So, many of you probably don't know anything about me or who I am or why I'm here, and my story actually my story tonight begins with Michael Ian Cedar over here.
My name's being mentioned so much today.
So the short story is that I was a professional chef for many years in New York, and I competed on the television show Chopped. And part of my story on Chopped was that I had a long career, well, I wanted to be a long career as a professional ballet dancer. But my career was very quickly cut short. I broke both my feet when I was 18, and I realized, well, I don't have a career in dance anymore, so I went to college, and I didn't know what I wanted to do there. And by the time I graduated college, I realized that when you make food for people, they like you more. So I decided I was going to become a professional chef. And so I did. And I started cooking, and then eventually cooking kind of replaced my love of ballet, and ultimately I competed on Chopped, and when Michael saw my episode totally randomly, there was a strong ballet component, and he reached out to me about talking about what life is like after you finish dancing. And that led to a larger conversation, and I spoke at his Legacy of You last year about a topic that I'm going to speak about tonight, which is mental health, and specifically about antidepressants and depression. And so through all of that, that's how I ended up here. And so when Bettina first reached out to me, she actually caught me at a time when I was pretty frustrated in my life, because this was October of last year, and I had just written an op-ed about antidepressant withdrawal, and I had sent it to Slate magazine. And this piece was very timely. There's a television show on NBC called This Is Us that some of you may have watched. And one of the main characters this year, Toby, was going through a storyline where he decided to dump his antidepressants down the toilet because he needed to increase his sperm count in hopes of getting pregnant. And now, obviously, anybody who's ever been on these meds or has been in the industry at all knows that dumping all of your meds down the toilet in kind of a moment of passion is really not the best call. And so Toby started going through withdrawal. But the way they portrayed this, I felt, was quite incorrect, and it definitely didn't line up with my own story. Toby got a little irritable, he wasn't quite himself, he was a bit shaky, and he had a little breakdown over the kitchen sink, but ultimately he went back on his meds, never addressed his issues, and the whole thing was effectively kind of swept under the rug. Meanwhile, during my own antidepressant withdrawal, I bent an ironing board in half out of rage. I'm talking one of those big, 6-foot-long metal ironing boards where if anybody in this room has used one, you know that they're kind of an infuriating contraption to begin with. The stupid legs, they get caught, the damn things rust, and it's 2018 at the time or whatever it was, and you're still wondering how the ironing board has not somehow made it into the 21st century. And so they're already infuriating, but in the midst of antidepressant withdrawal, which was the single worst thing I've ever been through in my life, I could not take it anymore. And somehow the amount of rage I had built up created this Hulk strength inside of me, and I bent the damn thing in half, and metal parts went everywhere, and it was incredibly satisfying, but also a little bit terrifying. So I decided to write an op-ed about this in hopes of portraying a different reality, as opposed to a Hollywood reality. But when I talked to the editor at Slate, she read my piece, and ultimately she passed on the piece because she said it was too similar to an article that was published on April 8th in the New York Times entitled, many people taking antidepressants discover they cannot quit. And because this piece was written to coincide with an episode of This Is Us, when she rejected it, there wasn't much I could do. I kind of just had to let it go, and I wasn't happy about it, but it was what it was. Meanwhile, that same week, an op-ed ran in the Wall Street Journal titled, "Leaf blowers are loud, ugly, and dangerous." And I was thrilled to see this piece because I hate leaf blowers. I think they are just like one of the worst things that has ever been invented, and that they are all about what is lazy and obnoxious about our society, and I was thrilled to see these damn things get demonized in the media. And then, a few weeks later, on November 1st, I caught an article in the Washington Post. This one was titled, "We know you love your leaf blower, but it's ruining the neighborhood." And it addressed very similar points that the article in the Wall Street Journal had addressed just weeks before. On November 9th, the Wall Street Journal, an article titled, "My short list of things that need to be de-invented." Leaf blowers show up right next to PowerPoint and smooth jazz. November 11th, the New York Times, a piece called "How to Rake Leaves on a Windy Day." It instructed people to put down the leaf blower because they're so terrible, and instead find zen by gardening by hand. November 14th, The Atlantic, a feature called "Something's Wrong with Fall in America," all about the unseen hazards of gas-powered leaf blowers. And then November 19th, the Boston Globe, "Break your leaf blower habit." So in the span of 1 month, there were 6 articles in major mainstream newspapers all about leaf blowers and how terrible they were for people and in the environment. Meanwhile, 2 articles about antidepressant withdrawal in the span of 8 months was apparently one too many. And so I did a little bit more digging. Google News actually returns 32,800 results for the term leaf blowers. It returns 8,060 results for the term antidepressant withdrawal. Now, 13% of Americans are also taking antidepressants, which is around 42 million people. So you'd assume that antidepressants and antidepressant withdrawal affect approximately 42 million people. And so, even though I know that leaf blowers and antidepressant withdrawal have nothing to do with one another, the numbers don't mean anything. I don't know why my piece was rejected. Maybe it wasn't that good. Maybe it just wasn't the right time. I don't know. But the point is that I was frustrated by the fact that this editor insinuated that the market was saturated, when this is an issue that I find to be incredibly important, because really, what is more important than our mental health? And so, I felt invisible. And it was right in the middle of these slews of leaf blower articles that Bettina reached out to me. And the timing was unbelievable because I finally felt heard. And so when I got to thinking about what to say tonight, I kept coming back to the leaf blowers, because I realized that they have oddly followed me throughout my entire mental health journey. And so as I mentioned, I was a dancer, ballet specifically. I was never loose enough either physically or emotionally to handle water. I trained at the Joffrey Ballet and then danced in a small company in my hometown. And when I was 14, I was cast as the Robin in an original production of The Secret Garden. And so, if you all know the story of The Secret Garden, it's about a young girl who is tragically orphaned in India when everyone in her family is killed in an earthquake. And so she is sent off to live in this big, gorgeous, scary castle, and she finds a friend and her cousin who's in a wheelchair who's off on the other end of the castle, and she's ignored by everyone else there, and she is led to this beautiful garden by a robin, and she finds this garden, and it's dead, and she tends it, and it comes to life, and it's beautiful, and as a child, I just loved it. So I was thrilled to be in this ballet, not only because I loved the movie, but because it was the first major role I had gotten to dance outside of the Nutcracker. And I was so excited to dance something other than the Waltz of the Flowers. And this production was absolutely stunning. The music was all Debussy, and I had a 5-minute long solo. at the end of the ballet to Claire de Lune. And 5 minutes is an exhausting eternity in ballet. But I loved it. The stage was gorgeous, the set was full of ivy and leaves and flowers, and my tutu was gigantic and covered in real feathers. On opening night, it wasn't open to the public. It was a very formal gala with black tie, champagne, past appetizers, no children were allowed. It was the highest of the high society in our auditorium in my hometown in Reno. My mother was there, as she always was. She, over the course of a 15-year ballet career, came to almost every single performance. But my father only usually came once. And he would bring the Wall Street Journal to the performance and read the paper whenever I wasn't on stage. But because of the hoity-toity nature of this particular event, he was forced to leave the Wall Street Journal at home, which means he got very bored. And he was always the biggest personality in the room, no matter the size of the room. So even on a packed house, on opening night, with a full orchestra, it was still no match for his monumental personality. And as I mentioned, this ballet was entirely set to Debussy, which is full of beautiful strings and crescendos that tend to come down to a bit of a quiet lull. And so as the audience was settling into their chairs and the orchestra began to play the overture, the curtain rose, and it revealed this set that would become this absolutely lush set with crawling ivy and leaves everywhere, all scattered across the stage. And it was just in that moment that my father decided to yell out loud enough for the entire packed house to hear, "Where's the dude with the leaf blower?" Only he didn't actually say the word dude, he used a different word, and I'm not going to repeat it here because it's highly inappropriate, but let's just say that he was able to get an entire audience of stuffy ballet snobs laughing, tears in their eyes, and absolute stitches. The orchestra actually had to wait for them to calm down before they could continue. And this was the side of my father that we all absolutely loved. However, we didn't get it very often. He struggled with his own mental health and experienced very long bouts of depression and rage. Today, he would likely be classified as bipolar 2. But in the 80s and 90s, when I was growing up, he was just a very difficult personality. And so when he died, about a year after that performance, his death brought a very complicated sense of relief. I missed the man who could bring an entire auditorium to tears of laughter. The same man who would bring me broken computer parts and teach me how to put the thing back together. I did not miss the man who broke the computer in the first place. And I was 15 when my father died. And on paper, this is where my own mental health journey begins. But the truth is that I had exhibited signs of anxiety, depression, and anger as a young girl, which really wasn't surprising given the environmental and genetic environment that I was born into. However, I was also a ballet dancer. And as a ballet dancer, we are taught from a very young age to hide our pain for the sake of performance. And so I took it as a personal challenge not to fall prey to the tropes, the emotional tropes of others. So when everyone around me laughed during a funny movie, I forced myself to remain silent. When I got my wisdom teeth out, I was given laughing gas. And I told myself that I would not laugh while I was on laughing gas just because that's what everybody else did, and that was not what I was going to do. And so I didn't laugh, just went to sleep. And when my father died, I did not cry at his funeral because that's what everybody else would have done. And so my grief, or lack thereof, was concerning to the adults around me. My issues began to accelerate and deepen to the point where my mother thought she was going to lose me too. So she took me to a psychologist, and then a psychiatrist, and ultimately I was put on a cocktail of antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs. This was 2001. mental health was barely in our collective conversation, and it really was not being talked about in the context of children and teens. And I was an only child. My mother was a newly single, grieving mother. What else was she supposed to do? And what else was I supposed to do other than follow the guidance of the adults around me? And so 15 years later, still on the same combination of drugs that I was put on as a kid, I found myself hanging halfway out my 30th story window, contemplating the amount of time it would take to hit the ground. I was nearly 30. My dance career was long gone. I was a chef and a business owner, living a typical Manhattan life, yet I was still massively depressed despite 15 years of antidepressants. And right about that time, an opportunity to travel around the world for a year fell into my lap. If I accepted the opportunity, I would go to Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Portugal, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Argentina. I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to get my prescriptions in these places, and I was not convinced that some sort of international pharmaceutical hiccup wouldn't send me into unexpected antidepressant withdrawal. And beyond that, I was beginning to wonder who I was without the medications, and so I made the choice to see a psychiatrist who did not support my decision to go off the drugs, and to get off the drugs anyway. So on a random day in March of 2016, I began weaning off the first of 5 drugs I was taking. Within hours of missing my usual dose of Effexor XR, my heart began to palpitate as if I'd injected myself with a dozen shots of espresso. Within days, flu-like symptoms set in. And it was right about the same time that my emotions went into overdrive, so in between the shakes and the tears, I felt like I wanted to saw off my own skin just to get away from myself. I developed an intolerable sensitivity to light and sound and could not walk out onto the streets of New York City without feeling like I was stuck in a crushing vortex of energy that could not be turned down. I ended up locking myself in my apartment because my mind was filled with bloody homicidal images that made Game of Thrones look like a tampon commercial. I literally tore the clothes off my back when shirts I'd worn for years became unbearably itchy. And that's when I bent that ironing board in half. And yet, in April of 2008, in that same article I mentioned earlier, Dr. Robert Temple, the Deputy Director for Clinical Science in the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, was quoted in the New York Times saying that withdrawal symptoms were not a serious focus of research because, and I quote, "If people's heads went through the roof from withdrawal, I think we would have seen it." So that's why I wanted to write that piece. And while these chemical side effects lasted only a few months, I found that the emotional and physical side effects lasted for nearly a year, and to some extent, they still linger. I was suddenly left in a body I no longer understood. Everything was different without the drugs. My eyesight got sharper. These glasses are new. My taste in music and television changed. My body developed a sudden intolerance to foods I'd eaten for years. And my hearing was so sensitive that I had to get custom earplugs made. And this is another reason why I hate leaf blowers so much, because even with custom earplugs, the sound of them still manages to just come in. And there are so many leaf blowers in the world. I mean, they are everywhere, and I can hear all of them. It's like I can hear them in my bones all the time. And believe me, there is nothing that makes you feel more nuts than having a total breakdown on a beautiful sunny afternoon because somebody is gardening. And so at the time, I did not understand what was happening to me. I didn't recognize myself or any part of my new world. I had spent my entire adult life believing that this depression was an inevitable part of me, something as innate to who I was as my heartbeat. My entire identity and every decision I made was unconsciously intertwined with this diagnosis. I rationalized my own pain by embracing my suffering and hoped that by acknowledging it, I would somehow find comfort. And the crazy thing about it was that I did find comfort. My depression, anxiety, and phobias, they all served a purpose. They kept me safe. They were familiar. They assured me that I would never have to venture too close to the edge of what brought me there to begin with. And they were constant no matter what was happening in my life. A loyal best friend that slowly drained my literal will to live and quietly affected every choice I made. And when you have something that quietly affects every choice you make, you ultimately end up where you are. And where I was in a place I didn't want to be, in a job I didn't want to be in a city I didn't want to live in, with people I didn't want to be around, and so I didn't like myself, and I was depressed. Still constantly depressed. But that was okay, because I was sick, and I was broken, and a doctor had told me so. But looking back, I think it was as if when my father died and I became medicated, I was burying a time capsule of grief into the ground. And in that time capsule, I placed grief and terror, sadness, insecurity, love, and trust. It simply hurt too much to feel any of those things, so I needed to bury them in order to survive. And then depression is what grew from that time capsule that I buried, and it marked itself on my heart. So when I got off the medication, I was also forced to dig up that time capsule from 15 years earlier. And that stable cocoon of depression and medication that I had built and relied on for so many years suddenly disintegrated. And I was left with nothing but what I had buried. And it all came rushing at me, all at once. Now, I expected, of course, to have to face my father's sudden death throughout all of this, because I knew that his death kind of kicked off all of my big struggles with mental health. But what I didn't realize was that throughout my life, including the times before he passed away, I had buried dozens of other grief-filled time capsules into the ground around me, including one from my ballet career. As I said, I broke both my feet when I was 18, and that was that. I went to college, I moved on, I thought I dealt with it, but I didn't. I buried it next to my father. We only ever associate grief with the death of a loved one. And even then, there's a hierarchy of sorrow. The loss of a child sits at the top. Parents and siblings come next. Long-term spouses come before boyfriends and girlfriends. Close friends follow. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, coworkers, pets, and acquaintances round up the rear. Youth and tragedy can send any one of these things up the hierarchy of grief. And if we're lucky, we only lose a handful of important people in our lives to the act of death during our time on Earth. But the truth is that our lives are marked with constant loss and change. And I believe that so much of our pain and sorrow is caused by a refusal to acknowledge loss and to grieve not only the people, but the things and experiences that we once loved. And nowhere is that more evident than in the life of a dancer. The serious dancer spends more time with her art than she does with her loved ones. Dance is a relationship. It is both nurturing and savage. And maintaining this relationship requires tenderness and intuition, but also hard work and unwavering dedication. And this relationship becomes as much a part of the dancer as breath itself. So when a career is cut short, whether by sudden injury, loss of interest, or even natural retirement, a death occurs. As Martha Graham said, a dancer dies twice. And yet, the death of a career doesn't fall anywhere on the accepted hierarchy of grief, nor does the loss of an important relationship, a falling out with a close friend, the loss of a business, a missing pet, a cross-country move, the sale of a home, or even the loss of a childhood stuffed animal. In truth, in one life, we need to grieve 1,000 deaths. So I ask everyone in this room tonight, what aren't you grieving? And how might your mental health change if you actually acknowledged the people, places, things, and experiences that you've lost. And no one has to know about this. That's what crying in the shower is for. Over the past 10 years, we've come a very long way when it comes to our conversation about mental health. People are no longer scared to admit that they see a therapist or take medication. And every week, it seems like a new celebrity reveals their diagnosis or struggle. And while this is great to help those who are suffering in silence feel like they're less alone, I've learned that this is only one half of the conversation. I am thrilled to stand before you tonight and tell you that it's been 2.5 years since I took my last antidepressant. And since the withdrawal symptoms subsided, I have not had a single depressive or suicidal episode. I continue to do the deep self-work, which includes grieving every little loss, in order to ensure that I am never tempted to pack up my experiences into a time capsule ever again. However, since getting off these drugs and beginning to tell my story, I'm disturbed by the current narrative surrounding our mental health discussion. Throughout my 15-year diagnosis, which included multiple professionals and thousands upon thousands of antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs, the word recovery was never once mentioned. Throughout the months of withdrawal and the year of rebuilding who I was, I never came across any literature, scholarly articles, or examples of any people who had successfully gotten off and stayed off these antidepressants for good. The hundreds of studies that exist around depression mostly focus on looking for markers that predict the course of depression as well as potential passive treatment. There's very little science on recovery itself, and so it's no surprise that there are so few accounts of people who thrive after depression and antidepressants. But here I am. The New York Times recently examined this phenomenon in another article entitled, "What's Life Like After Depression? Surprisingly little is known." This article states that depression has been, quote, recast in the medical literature as a darker, more permanent figure, a monster in the basement poised to overtake the psyche. But this attitude, I believe, is detrimental in our war against depression, and yet it has become ingrained in our vocabulary and thought process. But we will never find the solution living in the energy of the problem. And right now, all of our focus is on the problem. We must change the narrative from raising awareness for depression to raising awareness for recovery. Because depression is not something to be endured, and it is not something to cope with indefinitely. It is to be conquered. And we will never conquer it if we continue to give it so much power and create our entire identities around it. Science is slow. We can't wait for research to catch up and tell us how to fix this. That's going to be up to each individual. Which brings me back to the godforsaken leaf blower. It's a tool designed to alert everyone of a problem without actually solving it. I mean, think about it. What do leaf blowers do? They blow leaves loudly from one side of the street to the other. And yes, they clear off the sidewalk temporarily, but sure enough, ultimately, the leaves will return through a gust of wind, or from the trees above, or from the guy across the street with his own leaf blower who just blows them right back across. And to me, this feels a lot like our state of mental health right now. We're just blowing leaves around, looking for solutions in other people, in power, in money, and in pills. We have crappy jobs, lead unfulfilling lives, eat terribly, bury our grief, and medicate the hell out of people, and wonder why we have a mental health and addiction crisis. Now, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a pharmacist. I'm not a pharmacologist. I don't have a PhD. I don't have a master's. And really, based on my credentials, you have absolutely no reason to listen to me. It's also not my job to tell you or anyone whether or not they should be taking antidepressants. I truly believe that they absolutely have a place on the road to treatment, and I'm not sure I would be here without them. However, after 15 years, I don't think I would be here if I kept taking them either. And despite my lack of credentials and letters against my name, behind my name, I have done one thing that many of these people have not and are trying to figure out how to do. I got off these drugs, and then I cured my own chronic depression and anxiety without the use of pills. And here's how I did it. I spent over a year working with a counselor who specialized in a radical form of self-compassion-based therapy. I was not afraid to go as deep as I needed to go, and I was not afraid to get really, really weird with it. I made the very difficult choices to cut out the people and things in my life that were not serving me. But most importantly, I did the work. I showed up to my appointments, I forced myself out into the world, I asked for help, I refused to let a diagnosis define my life, and I had hope that if I could have little tiny moments of hope, if I could have one, then I deeply believed that I could have two. Once I got to two, all I hoped for was three. In short, I put down the leaf blower, and I picked up a rake. Thank you. So that was a lot of information and a lot of talking, and I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. So, yes. Feel free, if not, that's fine too.
Could you tell us about your trip around the world?
Yes, so I was accepted into a program called Remote Year. Is anyone here familiar with that program? Other than Michael who knows a little bit about it? Okay, so Remote Year is it was a startup that was thinly veiled, but it was really a social experiment. It still exists, where they took a bunch of people who could work remotely, so digital nomads, if you will, and I had left my business and started working as a writer. And so they took people who could work from their computers anywhere in the world, and they took 75 of us and basically put us all together and said, go forth and travel around the world together and see what happens. And so we had a group, like a social group, kind of built into our very odd travel schedule, but we were going to these like a variety of places. Going to Cambodia with 75 people is an experience in itself. And so I stayed with this program, and each month we traveled to a new place. And for me, what kind of happened is there were a lot of people who were learning how to work remotely. I was writing, but I was also really still coming out of my drug withdrawal period and really doing a lot of my therapy at that point. And what I particularly found was that each country kind of offered me this new gift. It was like, hello, Brooke, this is the issue you're going to work on this month. So a great example is when I got to Malaysia, which was our first stop. I had left New York, and in New York I was having so many issues with sound. And then I get to Reno, my hometown, where I spent 3 weeks kind of packing and just, reorganizing my life in the suburbs, and it was much quieter, and I was feeling all proud of myself, feeling like I had totally gotten over my issues with sound. And then I show up in Malaysia, which is effectively Asian New York, and it was like the world was just telling me, nope, you have not dealt with this issue yet. So I basically spent a month working with my therapist on my sound sensitivity in Malaysia, of all places. And then we got to Thailand, and there was a whole host of new issues that showed up there. So I spent Thailand working on some very specific issues around panic, because for whatever reason, it just all came up in Thailand. And so it was very interesting to me that I had managed to erase every aspect of my life that I could have blamed any part of my mental health on. I mean, I didn't have my people around me, my family was away, my job was gone, and yet, perhaps obviously, all of my problems were still there. And it was a very, very controlled way to basically say, like, hello, Brooke, you are the problem, you need to fix yourself before the world is going to fix itself for you. And so I spent the year getting to really dive into myself and learn how to deal with all these things and heal all the traumas that I had been through in this very isolated way. So my trip around the world was, it was less like parties on beaches and more crying in apartments as I learned to manage the sound of jackhammers in Asia.
Well, first off, Brooke is a fantastic storyteller, and if you're not following her on Instagram, follow her on Instagram. What's your Instagram handle?
My name, Brooke Siem, Brokesiem.
Well, one thing that you sort of touched on is when you were weaning yourself off of it, and you were doing it very responsibly.
Yes.
You sort of indicated here, it was still very, very physically and psychologically painful. Right? At a certain point, you just kept going. And you sort of indicated here, there's hope, there's hope, there's hope. But the pain was probably greater than the pleasure during that period.
Absolutely.
So what kept you going? Because this was something you touched on in the first time we interviewed together and filmed it. And I'd love for you to share that.
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things, and I mean, ever since going through this experience myself, I've started diving into a lot more of the science behind this to the point where I can understand, and also the protocols for antidepressant withdrawal. And what I've learned is that there is no real accepted protocol amongst professionals, and there are certain drugs that you can't just cut in half, because what happens is that you break the chains in the drugs themselves, and therefore it's less effective. So one of the drugs I was on, the one that I mentioned, Effexor, I was on the lowest dose already, and I could not just cut that drug in half in order to get less. It was not one that came in the little tiny beads, it was a tablet. So I had no choice but to just stop taking it. So it wasn't like I didn't pull a Toby and dump everything down the toilet. Like, I was doing what I was supposed to be doing and still had this massive, massive reaction. And that's part of what surprised me so much about this process, is that this had never been, I had never had a conversation about this. It was never in the realm of any conversation I'd had with a professional that this could even happen. And so I was very, very surprised. And the physical side effects were so intense in the beginning, but I was very lucky to have a solid support system around me. And my mother in particular, I had talked to her almost every single day when I was in New York, and I was talking to her multiple times a day when I was going through withdrawal. And so I would call her in an absolute emotional disaster of a panic, and she would talk me down. But the most interesting thing that she kept telling me was that my voice was changing. She kept saying, "You sound different, your voice is different, you have more intonation in your voice. I hear that you're different." And she told me that, and she would convince me to keep going. But the more she told me that my voice was changing, the more I started to notice those changes in myself, and I started to be able to look out into my world and notice what was different. And so in addition to all these very terrible things that were happening, I was having almost the opposite effect. Yes, I couldn't wear the same clothes I was wearing anymore, but I would walk outside, and I had this experience where I felt the rain on my skin for the first time as an adult. Like, it sounds a little ridiculous that I noticed it was raining, but it was really as if someone had taken the cellophane off my body, and I could feel the individual raindrops in my skin. And this was about a week into withdrawal. This was before the ironing board. And so, having felt the raindrop on my skin, and literally I was able to suddenly see the light bulbs and the street lights in New York. For so long, they just looked like a glow. And then I got off the drugs and I saw the edges of the light bulbs. I became intensely curious about these changes. And when I was in these really deep depths where I felt like I could not go on any longer, that's when I called my mother, and she told me to keep going. And so it was those little moments like the raindrops and the light bulbs, and I became more creative. I pretty much stopped sleeping, which was weird because I had slept for, I could sleep for 13, 14 hours in a day. I pretty much immediately stopped sleeping, and so I would stay up painting at night. And I don't paint, I'm a terrible painter, but I was suddenly very interested in it. And that was new. I hadn't felt truly interested in something for so long. And so that's when I was saying those little moments of hope. For me, they were tangible, they were basic. It was just this feeling of, well, I guess I like to paint now. What else do I like? And the more I did that, the more I started to learn who this person was without the drugs, and that helped me get through these periods where things felt very physically and emotionally unbearable.
If you could go back in time and tell your 15-year-old self, give yourself some advice, what would it be?
Man, that's kind of the thing about being 15, right? Is like you both think you know everything and know you know nothing at the same time. I think, unfortunately for me, I was kind of in such a state of shock. I have a lot of memory loss from that period in my life, so I'm not very good at actually kind of going back and saying, being able to put myself in a time and place with where I was. However, now I think what I would do different, and what I would ask the people around me to do different, would be to move slower and get second opinions. I think that simply the nature of mental health right now, there are many, many, many more options. In Reno in 2001, I mean, we had dial-up internet and everybody has a rifle behind their couch. So like, there was one child psychiatrist in town. I had no choice. That was the only place they knew to take me, whereas that's just not the case right now. And we know that there are so many different paths to ultimately get to the same place. So I think even if you talk to my mom now, we've had lots of conversations, and you know, I don't hold any resentment towards her for making this decision, but we both said that if we could go back, we would get second opinions, we would try a lot of things, and we would give it some time, because the reality was that I was also still grieving and dealing with trauma. Yes.
I have a question, follow up on what you said. You said if I could get one, I get two. So are you telling people that might be struggling to just, you know, set small goals?
Oh yeah.
Small steps?
Definitely. I mean, like, there was periods of time where it was literally like I would notice that I had 5 to 10 seconds of not feeling whatever I had been feeling. And I started to kind of calculate the amount of time in between those 5 to 10 second long spaces. So there was a period of time where I was having these big emotional breakdowns multiple times a day. And then one day I realized that I had only had one. And that was just like the biggest day, that I had only burst into tears or whatever it was, had to leave the room one time. And then there was a period where I got one day where I didn't have one at all. And that was just, I mean, that was the best. And so I just had to hope, like, all right, well, if I'm able to get one day going through it like a semi-normal person, then maybe I can get 2 days in a row. But the thing was that this was a very, very long process. I mean, literally, I was probably still having regular breakdowns, 5 or 6 a week throughout 8 months after I had taken my last pill. So it was a very, very slow process. So it was the things that kept me going were, I mean, I was doing this ongoing emotional and psychological work, but also just physically tracking things. I actually had a system where I rated my day on a scale of 1 to 100, and I would give it a rating, much like in school, so of kind of like this emotional rating. And I started to just try and get to 51% every day, because I had this rationale in my head that if I got to 51% every single day, by definition, if I averaged a 51% on the scale throughout my entire life, that meant my life was better more often than it was not. So I was not trying to get to this constant level of utopic joy. I was just trying to get to 51%. And by doing that, I started making very small decisions where every decision I made with 51% in mind. So it was like, well, do I want to eat this cheesecake or not? Will it make me feel 51% better or 51% worse? And I would make the decision and move on to the next one. And what I noticed is that these little incremental changes that just got me closer to that 51% helped me move along the line and ultimately get to a place where I realized when I went back, and I was literally graphing this out, I started having more days above 51%, and then it became rare that I was truly down below the 50% mark.
Hey, Brooke, today's all about raising awareness, and you've helped us with that.
Okay.
But what can we do? As friends, as family, what can we do?
So I think the thing that's really important to me is that I was using an analogy this morning with a friend of mine of if we treated cancer in the same way we treat mental health, we wouldn't have cancer marches with tens of thousands of people raising all of this money because they are determined to beat the hell out of this thing. We wouldn't have people who create entire businesses around the fact that they conquered this and survived. And so it's frustrating to me, whereas if you were diagnosed with some form of cancer and a doctor told you, okay, well, you have chronic cancer, you need to take a little chemotherapy every day for the rest of your life, and this is just part of who you are, I think the nature of cancer and the fight against cancer would be very, very different. But to me, it feels like the way we treat mental health, it's just okay, well, you've got a depression diagnosis, anxiety, or whatever it is, this is part of who you are, learn to live with it, learn to cope with it, and just go about your life. Whereas I don't understand why we don't talk about the context of recovery and what happens after, because how can we know that it's possible to recover from depression and anxiety and all these ailments that are just like truly an epidemic in our society if we never hear from people who've actually conquered it and thrived after it? So the smallest thing that I would do especially if you know someone is struggling, is, as cliche as it is, you gotta focus on the hope a little bit, but I think you really need to start finding people who have made it to the other side, because when you're depressed, the easiest and most comforting thing to do is to go on the internet and find people who feel like you do. And then it just becomes a feedback loop. And what we need are people and experiences and outlets, which is why To Write Love on Her Arms is such a wonderful idea of an organization, because they focus purely on hope, and it's why ballet and dance and all these things are so great, because it gives people an outlet. But we have to start focusing on recovery, otherwise we are just gonna live in the problem forever.
Thank you.
Yes?
You know, do you still have symptoms of anxiety and depression? If you do, how do you deal with them? And what type of support system did you give yourself? You weren't on the drugs anymore.
Mm-hmm.
What supported you getting it off? Because there had to be something else there to get you going.
Yeah, so I would say that I have not had any like long depressive episodes that I would say have lasted for, weeks on weeks, or anything that I would classify as going into a seriously concerning length of time. I've had days where I feel a little down. I've had days that feel familiar, almost kind of like going back through an old photo book. Like I recognize that part of myself and know that, it feels familiar, but I also know that it's fundamentally different. Anxiety is a little bit different. I think it's, for me anyway, it's easier to slip into anxiety because it's so easy to look into the future and get anxious, or have something going wrong and start having the loops play in your head. So the biggest thing that I did, as I mentioned, I did this type of, it's a fairly radical new form of therapy. It's based in self-compassion. And so it's a bit difficult to explain. It's one of those things where you kind of don't get it until you do it. But it's all remote. So the counselor's on the phone on the other end of the line, which is dual benefit, because me as the client, I get to be in my own room, in my PJs, surrounded by tissues in my bed, bawling my eyes out. Nobody's judging me, and when I'm done, I get to hang up the phone and turn over and go to bed, as opposed to having to get in the car, drive home, and sit there for an hour while somebody scribbles on a clipboard and silently judges you, despite the fact that you're pretty sure they're not supposed to do that. And so the way that this particular therapy works is you take whatever issue you have and you kind of speak to it in this very loving, compassionate way, as if it is a big part of yourself. And it's a series of phrases that are repeated that all begin with the phrase, "I'm so sorry." So let's use anxiety as a pretty easy example. If you have someone who's anxious and they're telling a counselor about their anxiety, the counselor might say, "I'm so sorry you're anxious," and then you have to respond back as if you're talking to yourself, "I'm so sorry you're anxious. I'm so sorry you can't get the voices in your head to stop. I'm so sorry you can't get the voices in your head to stop." And you do that for effectively an hour, and what happens is you end up going down this path that very unexpectedly leads to new places. And so you start making connections between parts of your life where the anxiety or the depression is manifesting and the root of it. And so it might not necessarily be a tangible root. It might not be, okay, when I was a child, someone took my stuffed animal away and that, made me feel unstable, and now I'm unstable as an adult. It's not always that obvious. For me, things were very visual. I would have visions of people in my head that I had never met from different eras, and they would kind of manifest in my mind as this thing that somehow was incredibly relevant to my situation, but also was nothing that I could root into our world, and yet we would still work at it and talk to that thing as if they were a real person and send it all the self-love and compassion, and it would literally start to heal itself in my mind's eye, and by the end of the session, I would feel like I had healed this wounded part of me. And so because I've been doing this so long, currently, I'm now able to use this technique on my own. So I very often do it in the shower if I'm having a particular issue, all my best crying and whatnot happens in the shower. So if I'm having a particular issue, I was having sleep issues recently and I was because there's a lot of anxiety around sleep, and so I went through this entire process in the shower, and I just was able to take myself down the process and get to a point where I isolated the root of the issue, and I knew as soon as I isolated the root issue, it was like it evaporated, and I can feel it go away in my body. So I think that there are other ways to do this and to reach the same level of awareness and be able to kind of deal with your issues as they come up. However, this is a fairly new technique. There's about 100 people in the world who are certified to do it, but I've seen it kind of weasel its way into other techniques, like there's compassion meditation. Dr. Gabor Mate, he works in addiction in Vancouver. He does a lot of work based in compassion around addicts. The meditation and mindfulness movement is kind of bridging with this. So that's what worked for me. It's weird, not a lot of people know about it, but that's what worked for me. Yeah.
How much was diet and exercise a factor in your recovery?
Oh God. I would actually say it was less of a factor than you'd think, because I was a very, very diet conscious and physical person before. And I was actually, I did ballet, and once I had to stop ballet, I started doing CrossFit in my mid-20s, and I became quite competitive. And I was actually on medication at the time, and so I became very dialed into my nutrition in order to get stronger. And very interestingly, when I got off the drugs, I don't have any scientific basis for this. I have reached out to a lot of researchers trying to find any studies on this, and it doesn't exist as far as I know. But I believe that I had kind of numbed my entire system. It was like my entire bell curve had flattened, and I think that included physical responses. So when I got off the drugs, I kept trying to train the way I was training, and it's really strange, but it was as if these antidepressants were a performance-enhancing drug, because they actually they raised my pain tolerance to a point where I could train really, really hard and not feel the physical, those physical effects. And so I started to get off the drugs, and I found that exercise actually was not sustainable for me, because my body could not handle it. It could not handle the physical sensations of hard, intense work and muscle building. So I had to go the opposite direction and learn to exercise and learn my new body in different ways. So I spent a lot of time walking. I started doing yoga, and I had to become aware and patient with the process of yoga and these very quiet movements, which helped me get to know the subtleties of my body. So at the time, I wasn't really watching my diet in particular in any way. I was traveling internationally, so my diet was literally different depending on the countries I was in. But mostly I tried to walk, I tried to move and sweat a little bit, but I wasn't particularly pushing the intensity because my body could not handle it. Okay. Thanks so much. Happy to answer more questions.